this computer. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. So glad to see you all today. Welcome to this next session in our summer-long series exploring the Gospel of Mark. We are to chapters 9 and 10 now. We are to the Transfiguration and a variety of other stories and some important teachings and healings. And today we welcome back Danielle Shroyer, a person who blesses us, thankfully, quite regularly with teaching and preaching, and was last with us in our Eastertide exploration of some of the resurrection appearances when we were looking at the story of the appearance on the road to Emmaus. Danielle is a pastor and an author and a spiritual director and an all-around marvelous human being, and I'm so glad to hear from her today and to have her with us today. So just a few reminders. The arc of the class, first roughly 20 to 25 minutes, give or take, we'll be hearing from Danielle as she gives us an overview of these two chapters. And then we'll break into small groups, have about 10 or 15 minutes of small group conversation that centers around an exercise of Lectio Divina, meditating on a passage of scripture, and then trying to sort of drill down on that passage for its meaning and the way God might be speaking to us through it. Then we'll reconvene for a final 15 or 20 minutes for some questions and concluding reflection. So Danielle, I turn it over to you, and welcome back.
Thanks. As always, the FIG Zoom game is strong. Like, I love all the backgrounds. It's very good. It's good to be with you all this morning. So I was looking through these chapters in preparation for this class and was just thinking, this is so much stuff, for Mark, who's it's such a brevity gospel, 9 and 10 are like hefty. It's a lot. So we'll try to sort of cover it, but what I wanted to do this morning, because there's just so much here and there's no way for us to really do total justice to all the amazing things that are happening, and there's just depth to all the teachings and miracles and stuff that are in here. I thought we would try to look at these two chapters thematically instead. So I don't know if any of you all are familiar with this book. It's called Heart and Mind by Danielle Shroyer. So the subtitle is The Four Gospel Journey for Radical Transformation. And I love Shroyer partly because he's Lebanese. And so he opens this book by talking about his Sittu and Jiddu. He was Maronite Catholic, which my family is Druze, so we have that distinction. But he always feels like, a cousin, a lost cousin. So he talks about actually how he realized when he studied cultural anthropology that there was this fourfold structure in everything. There was in rituals of initiation and in ways that different cultures sort of structured childhood to adulthood, there was always this fourfold process. And he went to seminary and studied at Notre Dame and realized doing theology that there was this fourfold process in spiritual transformation as well. And he started eventually to apply this and realized, there's this fourfold thing happening in the Gospels, of course, as well. And he noticed that the same four themes that he saw over and over again that seemed to him universal because of how many places they pop up, could be a lens through which we see Scripture. If you want to read the book, he talks about, and briefly, but he talks about how this is even true now in the way that we're understanding the world, and that there have been papers in the last 10 years talking about the scalability of our DNA is from 1 to 4. Like, once you get to 4, it's when your muscles change. Once you get to 4, it's when your metabolism starts at, the 1 to 4 thing is happening in biology, and it happens in he was a therapist, so he talked about how it happened in trauma therapy for him. Anyway, it has all these layers of where you see this sort of rule of 4. For our purposes this morning, though, I wanted to talk about his theme in this book, which is the Quadratus. And he talks about each gospel as having a different transformational theme. And I had to laugh because Mark's theme, you will not be surprised to find on the nose for where we are in 2020, is crossing the stormy sea. Mark's theme is the time and season. If you think about when the Gospel of Mark was written, of course, the Emperor Nero was just being a terrible human to the Messianic Jews living at the time, and it was really dangerous. You know, it was scary to be a person of faith during that time. And there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen. And all of this culminated in the way that Mark tried to tell the story of Jesus to this group of people. And so the theme for Mark is crossing the stormy sea. And I know last week when you looked at chapter 8, of course, you saw, I mean, there are so many places where you can see this. They're constantly crossing the sea. And last week in 8, you see Jesus being frustrated that here they are and they've got this group gathered when they get to the other side of the sea, and this group wants to be fed, and they're like, what? How can we do it? How can we do it? And he's like, how many things have you seen me do, kids? How many times can I show you that I have got this and there's some abundance waiting for you, right? So you can almost hear Jesus getting frustrated that the confusion and fear that the disciples keep falling into is frustrating to Jesus, because he keeps showing them abundance and keeps showing them faithfulness and steadfastness, and that it's maybe not going to be perfect, but it's maybe going to be okay. And so in 9 and 10, we see that same theme come across. And Shaya talks about how in Mark, the primary question that's being asked is, what do we do with our suffering? Which again is just a really critical question for us right now, when so much of the world is suffering and there are so many difficult things happening all around us. And so what would it look like for us to see these 2 chapters in Mark as a question of that? Like, what do we do when we encounter suffering? He suggests that 2 things tend to happen. One of them is that we try to go back to what's familiar. Of course, this is the Exodus story. Like, oh, that we could have those flesh pots that we used to have in Egypt, you know, that traditional thing that because we don't feel certain in the present, we want to go back, even if it's negative, to something that felt more secure. And of course, that's never possible, because they're always crossing the stormy sea and landing in a different town, and they are encountering different things. And so part of the Gospel of Mark is this affirmation that you've got to stay in the boat and just get where you're going, and you can't go back, you know. The second thing we tend to do with our fear of suffering, or just our encountering with suffering, is that we try to rush through it and not pay attention to it. I think Shaya describes it as kind of like rushing towards a group hug, you know, like, it's fine, we're fine, everybody's fine, it's okay, we're okay. And the avoidance of the feeling of suffering in our bodies also prevents us from having transformation. So wanting to go back to what we know is a way to prevent the transformation of what's trying to be born within us. We're shutting down this birthing that might be happening if we go back to what's secure. But also, if we rush through it too quickly and we don't pay attention to the suffering that we are feeling and to all the things that that's bringing up for us, we may also be shutting down something really important that's trying to get born within us. We're not allowing that fire to burn what it maybe needs to burn. So the one beautiful thing I'll say, even though that all feels maybe a little heavy, right? This is about suffering. This is about crossing a stormy sea. It's about endurance, staying in the boat, keeping faithful, is that Mark's gospel does always have these little slivers of hope. Now, he's not effusive about them. You know, he's not Luke, but he never leaves people in the despair. He's always saying, even if it's caustic, like it is in chapter 9, like, hey, it's better for you to lose your hand than not be in the kingdom of God. And he means that as this way of affirming, listen, I know this is hard, but being in God's realm is the main thing here. And if you do that, just trust that that's going to pay off for you. Just trust that that is good work that you're putting into the world. And so he does offer these little glimpses of hope and these little snippets of miracles that he talks about as a way to help us feel like we can endure when we feel like we're in that marked season of life, when it's just all about suffering. It's all about just enduring. It's just about getting to the end of the day and getting to the next morning, So I know that probably you maybe haven't read through the 2 chapters. And if you had, we can still take a couple of minutes just to let everybody have a second to look through chapters 9 and 10. But as you do that, we're going to come back together and talk about where we see the suffering and the confusion, particularly in the stories that we see. So one of the sub themes, I think, under this sort of umbrella of suffering that we see throughout the Gospel of Mark is that in these 2 chapters, there's just so much confusion. Again, in 8, we saw the disciples being like, how are we going to feed these people? And Jesus is like, I got it. We'll figure it out. I always find a way. And this continues again in 9 and 10, where they feel confused about things. And then there's tension about how that confusion creates uncertainty and what that brings up in the disciples and how they respond. So as you're reading through these chapters, just notice, where's the confusion? Where do you see the confusion here? And then kind of what do you see the disciples doing as a response to that confusion? So we'll just take a couple of minutes to read through, and then we'll come back and talk about what we found. So where did you see confusion happening?
All over the place.
All over the place.
Certainly during the Transfiguration in a big way.
Yeah, the Transfiguration. Well, tell me more about what you saw, how you would describe the confusion there.
Well, what I thought was a little bit humorous was it states that they didn't know what to say because they were terrified, but that didn't stop Peter from talking nonetheless, right? So even though he didn't know what to say, it just gives me the sense that he was just kind of yammering whatever came to his mind. It's like, well, let's build some tents for everybody, but he really didn't know what else to throw out there.
Yeah, it's classic. The classic, like, I don't know what's happening, so just here's some word vomit. I don't know. I feel uncomfortable, so I'm gonna fill it with even more uncomfortable things that I don't even know what I'm saying. I haven't thought it through, right? It's interesting that Shia says that he thinks that the Transfiguration is a big moment in Mark's gospel, and partly because it's kind of the symbol through which we understand this heightened level of mystery and confusion and this desire that we have to solidify that in some way. And so he said, even in the word transfiguration, it's like a cross. Like, it's not going to be straight, it's going to be a cross. So it's this idea symbolically that it's going to be this road less traveled. It's not going to look the same way. It's about staying in the mystery and letting it unfold. So yeah, the Transfiguration is this symbolic description of how we experience mystery, and then we do all we can to try to solidify it or make sense of it, instead of just let it transform us in the mystery of its own self, right? What else did you see?
Well, when he speaks of his death and resurrection, beginning in chapter 30, 32, and in 32, the disciples don't have a clue as to what he was talking about. That also real confusion.
Yeah, and at the end of that verse, it says they didn't understand what he's saying, and they were afraid to ask him.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Like, I would think, man, if you're sort of right next to Jesus like that, I feel like I would have been asking him questions all the time, but I guess I wonder if they feel they just know how much they don't know. And so it's so embarrassing that they can't even, it's like when you feel bad in a class that you're so behind that you don't even know what to ask the teacher to help you anymore.
I
Or,
also,
or maybe you're afraid you'll display your ignorance to the teacher, so you don't ask.
Yes, that's such a good point. You don't want to let him know how much you're in the dark about it.
we also tend to make Jesus into our buddy. I mean, that's a real contemporary kind of American Christian thing to do. Jesus is clearly our buddy, and we would just chat with him about anything, any old thing on our mind. We just chat. And what Mark consistently portrays Jesus as being is someone with such raw power that they like don't even know what to make of him. He's like not their buddy at all. And
Yes.
and we've projected that onto him. But when they were in his presence, they felt love, and they clearly felt something of the mystery of God, or else they wouldn't have sacrificed so much. But they weren't chummy in a way that I think we sometimes think that they might have been.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Buddy Christ. Have you all seen this?
Yes.
From the movie Dogma? Yes, that idea that we've made him so docile. Yeah.
Yeah. And the preceding scene to Michael's, when they're trying to heal the boy, and we have the confusion of the disciples not understanding how to heal him, and just this whole sort of like long protracted scene of everybody kind of like not sure what to do or how to help or what to say, and then this really beautiful but interesting exchange between Jesus and the Father, in which the Father clearly knows Jesus is able to help but doesn't really know how. And that wonderful line with "I believe, help my unbelief." So there's confusion mixed up deeply in this scene of healing and transformation.
Also,
Yeah.
I see in like still chapter 9, but like in verse 34, he asked them what they were arguing about. You know, they got to Capernaum, I think. Yeah, Capernaum, and he asked them what they were arguing about. You know, that is in ways kind of confusing too, because they were arguing, you know, what they were talking about. You know, that starts confusion too, because it's
Who's the
like,
greatest? They're arguing about who's the greatest, which is a totally confused notion of what it's all about.
yeah, it's like, because you see that a couple of times through 9 and 10, where he asked them what you were talking about or arguing about. Because he asked him a couple of times.
And the strange thing to me is that I don't know if this is, you know, technically, literally sequential, but in the way we read the gospel, Jesus just tells them, hey, I'm going to be betrayed and killed. And then they're like, who do you think is the best? You know, it's such a strange, you know, again, is this a fearful sense of confusion where they're trying to, you know, what's happening here within them, that's how they respond to this really scary, confusing news that Jesus just shared with them. Yeah.
And if one of them was the best, what did they think? They were going to get a prize?
Right.
Like, oh, you're going to die. Okay, but I'm the best. You love me the best. Like, what does that get you?
Right. Yeah. That's a totally fair point. Jesus is doing great, and he just said he was going to die. So, like, why do you want to be in that party?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of confusion about who's important and who's not. So we have all that, the scenes about children, and children as representative of like who's unimportant, and yet Jesus saying they are very important. The wealthy, Jesus upending confusing notions of importance around wealth, and people just really not really understanding that. You have the scene in the exchange with the rich man. So tremendous amount of confusion about how this shakes up notions of importance and God's blessing.
Yeah, they do seem truly baffled how a wealthy person could not just easily get into heaven. That just seems so countercultural to what they've known to be true.
And of course, we don't have that problem in our society today.
Oh no, we fixed that right up.
Well, and Jesus seems a little exasperated in the last part of chapter 9, talking about how long must I endure you? And what do you mean if it's possible?
That one kind of bothered me a little too, because it was like, I can understand Jesus' frustration with a lot of the other situations, but it's like, come on, this is hard mode. Give these guys some slack.
Right. Yeah, and it does seem, he definitely did that in 8, saying like, why, what else do I have to do for you people to understand this? And you see that a couple of times in these chapters, that he just seems frustrated that they don't get it. And so I don't know, the confusion too is, I wonder if his frustration was confusing to them. Like they're like, well, we actually haven't healed people that much before. We don't actually know how this thing works. There's not a textbook for you do A, B, and C, and then this person gets healed. And so they're just trying to figure it out. And I wonder if they're also just confused by that response. Like, well, of course you're frustrated. We're frustrated too. We don't know what we're doing. All of this is just completely in a fog. We haven't ever had someone transfigure on a mountain before. It kind of feels like so many of my friends who are therapists or social workers or whatever that have kept saying during this pandemic, like, it's okay, be gentle with yourself, we've never done this before. That sense that like we are trying to acknowledge to ourselves that we just have to keep saying how much we don't know what we're doing, because this is just all new. But this is probably how the disciples felt too.
Yeah. What do? Do we spit on them? Do we rub them on with mud?
Right.
Lay hands on them? And he says it's just through prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said with this kind, he can only come out with prayer. Like, how would they know that?
Right. And which kind? Like, could you tell me so that next time I know that kind and I can write in my notebook, this kind, But I wonder if on a deeper level too, to sort of put this back into Shaya's understanding of moving from confusion to faith, the sense that I wonder if what he was asking them to do is simply take a moment and actually center themselves in prayer instead of just thinking that they knew what they were doing. Sometimes when you, especially if you've been a Christian for long enough, you almost just jump into something thinking that, as a Christian, I know what I'm doing here. And then you didn't actually ask God, in this moment, what is it that you're asking me to do? Or would you please guide me and offer me the power of the Spirit to do this thing? Sometimes we forget to ask. And I wonder if part of the frustration that Jesus is feeling and the confusion that the disciples are feeling is about that lack of centering. Right? This might be part of the transformation that Mark is teaching us, that in the midst, especially of suffering, especially of confusion, don't rush into answers, don't rush to action. Take the time to figure it out. Take the time, at least if you can't figure it out, take the time to be with God and at least get your soul to where it feels centered before you do something.
I think that's another thread through this is his rebuke of their presumptuousness. Like they keep presuming to know what the right thing to do is, or how to do it, or how the world works, and he keeps saying like, no, you be careful about all that presumptuousness. And here, I thought that was really beautiful. My little annotated Bible mentions that in the Gospel of Mark, in every one of Jesus's prayer sessions, so every time prayer is specifically mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are absent or unable to stay awake. So this little line, like this kind can only come out through prayer. It's not something they're particularly good at or have been working very hard on.
Right. Yeah, that is such a good point. And it reminds me, I was listening to Alice McKenzie. Has she been at FIG before? I kind of feel like maybe she has.
Yeah, she's guest preached for us.
Okay, she's so lovely. She's a lovely person, but she's a preaching professor at Perkins. Lovely. And she actually talked about in these chapters that she sees 4 roots at play in 9 and 10, and she said, there's fear that the disciples have fallen in Jesus's estimation. Like they're worried about what Jesus thinks of them. There's insecurity at their failure to heal this boy. There's resentment towards one another when Jesus chastises them. And there's this eagerness to compete to regain his approval. And I thought that was a very well-spoken way of saying, okay, what do we do when we experience suffering and confusion? What happens internally with us as humans? Well, we're afraid, we get insecure, we get resentful, and we get competitive. You know, Jesus says, I'm going to die. And they think, I don't know what to do without this leader. And so can I be in charge? Am I the best? You know, I mean, just what weird things we do in our humanity to try to, I don't know, manage our anxiety, I guess. And so what's the transformation that's waiting for us there? Or I guess before we can say that, we could ask, what lies are they understanding or believing about themselves and about Jesus that just aren't true, that are leading them to that thing? Like, for example, one would be, okay, they're afraid that Jesus thinks less of them. Is that actually true? That because they didn't know how to heal this boy, that Jesus thinks badly of them or less of them? Jesus is clearly frustrated, but you know, any parent that you'd ask and said, well, okay, when you were frustrated with your child, did your actual core love for them change in any way? Well, no. I mean, you're frustrated, but that wouldn't remotely touch the golden treasure of love that you have for that child, right? And so for me, obviously, I always think about original blessing, but I wonder if so many of these fears and confusions and the way that they come up, this competitiveness, this like one-upmanship, all these things that they're trying to do to make themselves feel better about who they are, is coming from a deep sense of insecurity at the root, which is, do I trust that God loves me and that God is with me and that God is going to be here for me no matter what? And if we don't have that as our foundation, it's very easy to get thrown, you know, talk about the stormy sea. You're going to get tossed by the tide of every emotion that you have that tells you differently, right?
Absolutely.
So I don't know. It would be interesting to think about what would it have looked like if they didn't have insecurity? You know, would they have asked Jesus questions when he said, here's what's going to happen to me, and they were afraid to ask questions? What if they had asked questions and then we had a record of Jesus explaining something, right? And saying, well, let me tell you something deeper about that because you've been paying attention, and, you know, that didn't toss you to the side. Yeah, when you can't do something that Jesus asks you to do, is that really a sign of unworthiness in you? Or is that your fear talking? Is that your, you know, your concern? I know we've always all had times in our lives when I hear it all the time in spiritual direction, that we have these stories that we tell ourselves about God and the way that God sees us, and they're almost all untrue, you know? The one that is true is the one that we tend to hold on the least, you know, that sense that like we have what we need. It's going to be okay. It might not be what we want, but it's probably going to be okay because God is with us, you know? And this again brings us back to Shaya's point that in this season, the Mark season of our transformational life, the thing that we need to learn is that God is present and that God will prevail in some way. That doesn't mean that even we will prevail, because Mark says over and over again, you might lose your life for this, you know, but if you do, it will be in service to this thing that will prevail, which is about, as you know, this hopeful thing that he's trying to send to them, that they're involved in something that's bigger than who they are. Something deep undergirds their lives, but it's really hard to do that, right? Just to sort of stick in the mystery of the things and the unknown and the uncertainty, and find trust and love and sort of stability in that, right? Okay, well, I want to make sure that we have time.
Yeah, let's break out into our groups.
Yeah.
Because we need to spend about 10 or 15 minutes doing a little bit of deeper reflection in small groups. And we're going to do Mark 10.
46 to 52, that last little section.
All right, let me put it into the chat so that it's there, and then I'll put it up on the screen. Okay. So here we are. So we're going to reflect on the healing of Bartimaeus, the very first exegetical paper I ever had to write in seminary. This is like my New Testament professor's favorite thing to assign, this story. So you're going to read this story, friends, and I invite you to read it a couple of times. Maybe pick one person to read it through. Consider the word or phrase that stands out to you. Read it through a second time, and then start to ponder what God might be trying to say to you, perhaps in that word or phrase, or perhaps more broadly in the story as a whole. Danielle, do you have anything that you want to invite people to reflect upon as they ponder this story?
I would just encourage you as you're doing your Lectio today to hold your own feelings of confusion and fear and insecurity and competition, those places in your life where you feel those are sort of being brought up, and that you would just hold those close so that the Spirit works with those as you move in this chapter.
Okay. All right, friends. So it is in the chat for you to read. We'll take about 15 minutes. So we'll come back around 5 past and conclude with about 10 minutes of closing conversation. So let me put you into. There we are. You should be invited into a group and jump on in, and we'll see you back in about 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. Come on back. We'll let everybody regroup, and then we'll see where the conversations took you. Okay. Y'all, I wonder, what did you explore? What stood out to you? How did this theme of confusion and remaining in that place, how did that provoke you today? And certainly welcome the insights and the sharing of those who may not regularly share. So if you are somebody who often stays quiet, we would love to hear from you today. Please tell us all about what you spoke about today.
So I'll share. My take on that passage was that when Bartimaeus was asking for Jesus's help or to follow Jesus, and he was rebuked and he was told to be quiet, and he was told not to approach Jesus. And I think that my sense on that is that as Christians, we were told by Jesus that there would be times when we would be face resistance, maybe persecution, maybe even death for following him. And I think that was Bartimaeus was that was the thing. People said, "Be quiet," and so it was Jesus is telling us that you're going to have people to tell you as Christians to be quiet or stand off or stand down and don't express your faith. And so by expressing his faith, Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus. That was what I heard in that passage.
Drew, thank you very much. Others?
Something I was asked to share. So what we were talking about in my group was I guess something that stands out to me about that same thing that we were just talking about. So the man is asked to be quiet, and on the one hand, that seems callous, but on the other hand, one thing that always strikes me about Jesus, where I would definitely not want to be Jesus in certain situations, is to imagine like the moment that you announce to the public or demonstrate to the public that you're able to heal somebody. Surely from that moment forward, 24/7, there would be no end to people coming to you asking for healing. So also, I wonder if the people asking him to be quiet were of the mind of like, come on, give this guy a break. He can't just, he has other things to do besides just heal everybody nonstop all the time. And I wonder if that's part of the, best intentions behind that.
Thank you, James. So a different way of interpreting the story. Yeah. A much more sympathetic reading of the disciples shushing than is commonly given to them. So thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, our group, this is we were kind of coming to the same conclusion that as we were speaking in the beginning of today, just that there's always a lot of confusion. But God always seems to know, Jesus knows what we need. So him asking us, or asking Bartimaeus to say what he needed, kind of is like us needing to clarify our own needs and be able to say that before Jesus, even though he already knows. He wants us to be able to clarify our own thoughts so that we can be aware of what we're actually asking.
Yes, it's not like the man's ailments are a mystery. He's a blind beggar. I mean, like just standing there, it would have been abundantly clear what any of us would assume he wanted. And yet Jesus asks him to speak for himself. He's pushing against that presumptuousness. Yeah.
I think
Other
his
thoughts, please.
persistence. Jesus is rewarding persistence from a lot of people, like the woman who was compared to a dog. She was persistent. Bartimaeus is persistent in shouting and not letting anyone stop him, to the point where Jesus is like, okay, everybody else be quiet, let him come. And then, like Lauren mentioned, what do you want? And I think this is instructive to me personally I need to be clear in my own mind. What do I want? And be persistent about asking for it. Now, again, the answer may not always be yes. Sometimes the answer is no. But sometimes the answer is yes. And then that's when I work with God to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is the catalyst for his healing? I mean, Jesus says
his own faith.
Faith has made you well. He doesn't say, all right, I'll heal you. He doesn't like lay hands on him or do some sort of incantation. He listens to the man ask for what he wants, and then tells him that it is actually his faith that has been the catalyst for his healing and transformation.
Perhaps as he's nearing the crucifixion, he's trying to say, the vehicle is faith, not necessarily dirt, spittle, mud, other things. The vehicle is your trust in me, right? So.
Yeah. You talked about the word go and what that meant. Did it mean go and spread the word of what I've done and how you've been healed? Did it mean just done? I'm done. It's finished. You're healed. And we also talked about how fun it is to kind of read this and really dissect things, because when you read the whole chapter, you might very easily just go over the word go. It's just one word, 2 letters. But when you're dissecting it, someone in our group said, what did it mean? There's different ways of taking that. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I pointed out in my group that one of the a translation I've read actually reads into it the meaning of go home. But instead, what he does is he follows Jesus. He doesn't go. He stays with Jesus all the way, we assume, into Jerusalem.
there are some lovely traditions of what happens with Bartimaeus and what happened to him on the other side of the resurrection, as he was almost certainly a spectator to the week, because Jesus goes straight from here to Jerusalem and begins that climactic final week, and people have speculated, and there's some traditions around Bartimaeus being sort of part of that broader entourage. Maybe a final thought. Any other reflections? Thank you, Carrie, very much. Other final thoughts as we wrap up today? Danielle, do you have any other thoughts that you want to make sure to share with us as we conclude today's session?
I was just going to say, I love ending with this because this story of Bartimaeus really showcases all that I think the Gospel of Mark is trying to teach us. What do we do with our suffering? Well, we're persistent, we persevere, and we have faith. And I think it's worth noting that Bartimaeus didn't say, I understand theologically what's happening here, or I totally get how you're going to heal my eyes biologically. You know, he probably had just as much confusion about how it would happen, or, you know, it doesn't matter. Confusion is a constant companion of ours. And the question is, in our confusion, do we have faith? In our confusion, can we trust in the mystery, trust God, right? So I just love that this 9 and 10 kind of ends with this declaration of someone who really does what Mark is hoping that all of us do when we read his gospel, which is to trust and persist and stay present to our suffering, you know. But I did have a prayer that I would love to end us with, if that's all right.
Perfect. Wonderful.
It comes from this wonderful Life Prayers book. It's one of my favorites. And this is from the Terma Collective. May our eyes remain open, even in the face of tragedy. May we not become disheartened. May we find in the dissolution of our apathy and denial the cup of the broken heart. May we discover the gift of the fire burning in the inner chamber of our being, burning great and bright enough to transform any poison. May we offer the power of our sorrow to the service of something greater than ourselves. May our guilt not rise up to form yet another defensive wall. May the suffering purify and not paralyze us. May we endure. May sorrow bond us and not separate us. May we realize the greatness of our sorrow and not run from its touch or its flame. May clarity be our ally and wisdom our support. May our wrath be cleansing, cutting through the confusion of denial and greed. May we not be afraid to see or speak our truth. May the bleakness of the wasteland be dispelled. May the soul's journey be revealed and true hunger fed. May we be forgiven for what we have forgotten and blessed with the remembrance of who we really are. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Wow, a perfect way to end. That was just right. Thank you. Friends, thank you all for